Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go through a few administrative things and then introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor David Engels. One is that we would like you to sign some of you are already on it, but if you're not, we'd like you to sign up to get our emails about recollection and other lectures. It's called the Recollection Lectures mailing list, but actually you'll get information about our theological conference, which will be next summer on the Imago Dei, and our relation to it, and God's relation to it, and the world's relation to it. That's going to be a very large conference, maybe up to 300 people, the way we do them here at Pusey, our fourth in this series of 3. The Recollection Lectures mailing list is used just for that purpose of letting you know about the academic life of the house, our colloquia, our lectures, and whatnot. If you like, give us your details. If not, just pass it on. The second is we have term cards and lecture term cards here. This has the full worship schedule of the house and the remaining lectures. And this one is just the academic program. I'll pass this around in a basket that can be used for other purposes, should you like. Pusey House, house rich in many things, but not actually rich. We would like to turn the lights on in the chapel, but they aren't there. So we're raising money, and when we get enough, we'll put lights in the chapel so that you can see the preacher and others. Take a term card if you like, leave something if you like. If you prefer to donate by card, we have a machine that you could use at the end. That's done. I want to draw your attention really quickly to a lecture that's taking place here in our series where we deal with literature on the 29th of May, and that's on piety and versus polemic, the paradox of Elizabethan satire, with Jane Cooper, a friend of ours, who's an examination fellow from All Souls College and a member of the community. Come in, sit anywhere you like. And also, we have Joan O'Donovan on the 12th of June on the public authority of the Church of England. That is the theological foundations of the public authority of the Church of England. It's a historical theology. And that's the recollection lecture attached to a conference we're doing in coordination with the MacDonald Center at Christ Church on the public legitimacy of the Church of England, which you're most welcome to attend, which is on Monday, the 10th of June. Full information is in these term cards here. On YouTube, you can find many of our lectures. We're curating it so that you can find more of them. And eventually, if you want to have a repeat of the lecture you're about to hear, you could go there to find it. Join us on Facebook if you're still on it, or what the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you're on it, follow us and tell everyone, tell the world about us. Now, that being said, we're pleased to welcome Professor David Engels, who until very recently was the titular professor of Roman history at the Free University of Brussels. There are 2 of them. It was the French one. In Belgium things go and multiply linguistically, and at the Free University. And now actually he's busy in France, and I've even written it down. At the Institut Catholique d'Études Supérieures as a lecturer teaching universal history. And we've asked him to answer a question which for us and for people like us is often on our minds. How can we think of history sensibly without descending on the one side into relativism, or on the other side into maybe a sort of materialistic or not very interesting universalism? There's temptations toward perennialism, there's temptations toward a very specific type of salvation history, or there's a temptation to give up the discipline completely and just say, we don't do history anymore. As an historian, I think that's not what Professor Engels is going to argue, that we should give up the discipline, but he might tell us some way we can split the difference and continue to do history without being a victim of any of the vices that would meet us on all sides of history well done. So without further ado, Professor Engels.
Yeah, dear Jonathan, the organizer, thank you a lot for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak to you today on this subject of universal history, which is indeed one of my main concerns for many years, and which is also a large part of my personal endeavors to work on some form of system that is perhaps a bit more concentrated on political history than really on philosophy or theology, but that nevertheless tries to examine history under a philosophical angle and to make real sense out of that. So must a systematic comparison of civilization automatically lead to a historical relativism, where truth becomes a mere matter of style? Or is it possible to identify behind the uncompromising workings of history a subliminal metaphysical sense that is neither a Eurocentric variation of the history of salvation nor a vulgar theory of accumulation and progress? In the following, we will try to sketch some answers to these questions on the basis of a new morphology of history. Of course, the notion of cultural morphology seems to be quite outdated nowadays, as modern historiography seems to be focusing mainly on two categories: humanity and the individual, while all entities in between, such as peoples, nations, religions, or civilizations, are systematically deconstructed. Thus, on the one hand, we find an increasing number of diverse global histories stressing how humanity tends, or is supposed to tend, despite all temporary setbacks, towards linear progress in all possible fields such as technology, liberty, equality, globalization, etc. An obvious and increasingly fragile projection of some tendencies of recent Western history onto world history, which also provides the framework of the assessment of progress and regress in history. In order to focus solely on humanity as relevant historical actor, such a top-down approach to history must conveniently blur all borders between regions, peoples, nations, religions, or civilizations. Hence, the importance of fashionable notions such as cross-culturality, creolization, intersections, or transformations. On the other hand, we find historiographers and philosophers essentially stressing the importance of the individual as main agent of history, insisting on the presumption that the inner dynamic and shaping power of collective social entities are much less relevant than individual decisions and constitute only the mechanical aggregate of their individual components. Free will, chaos theory, and good old Western individualism all work hand in hand in order to provide the background of this bottom-up approach. It is somehow ironic that the more these two theories become predominant, the less they are convincing. Indeed, if the last few decades have shown one thing, it is the resurgence of civilizations, of religions, of nations. And our academia seems to be adamant about the conviction that these entities are mere mental constructions and thus need not to be taken serious. It cannot be overlooked that in past as in present history, the overwhelming majority of people on this earth prefer to ignore the theories of Western academics and continue taking these solidarity communities extremely seriously. Obviously, modern historiography seems so engrossed and fascinated by its own normative expectations of a future world without borders that it tends to project its hopes back into the past and denies the existence of past collective dynamics only because it would like to see them disappear in the future, leading to such absurd situations like ancient historians trying to explain away notions such as the fundamental opposition between East and West, or the crisis of the late Republic, or the downfall of the Roman Empire as being mere elite discourses. In the following, we'll try to avoid these pitfalls and show how a philosophy of history, once again, taking into account the existence of civilizations and their very specific and individual dynamics, can provide an alternative to the present-day dead end of research and also provide a framework for the ever more popular research discipline of cultural comparatism. So indeed, the comparison between civilizations is becoming more and more popular. In studies comparing the Roman and the Chinese empires, the Mesopotamian and the Greek city-states, or medieval and Japanese feudalism abound. However, as these studies are generally limited by the research paradigms outlined above, they usually only produce frustrating results, as they limit themselves to merely empiric comparisons and have no real means in providing a priori definitions of why certain civilizations or periods are chosen as elements of comparison. Of course, there have been numerous attempts of narrowing down the scope of comparison by focusing on certain constitutions, certain forms of economical organization, or certain civilizational challenges. But these attempts mostly ignore the specific dynamics as well as individual characteristics of past civilizations, where similar features taken out of their context can serve very different historical aims. Comparing French colonialism in the 19th century AD and Qin colonialism in the 4th century BC makes sense, whereas comparing the Mongol Empire and the Plantagenet Empire does not. While the empiric approach is thus ultimately disappointing, the vitalist model, like we find it, for example, in Spengler, trying to find a solution to this issue of singling out relevant areas of comparison by interpreting all civilizations as living organic entities, also has its weak points. On the one hand, transferring biological concepts onto political or spiritual matters may explain the evolution of the form, but not necessarily the content of history. On the other hand, vitalism ultimately fails because of its unsolved relativism. By creating a dualism between the logic of organic and the logic of unorganic entities, it falls into the trap of all dualisms and ultimately only provides an aesthetic answer to the main question of the metaphysical sense of human life and thus of history. This is why the model of dialectics seems to be much more promising, at least from my point of view, as it manages to link metaphysical to historical speculations and to provide a rather convincing answer to the interplay between the one and the many, between the transcendent and the material. However, at least from a Hegelian perspective, dialectics is generally applied to the understanding of world history in its entirety. And while the 19th century could still relish in a trinitary understanding of world history as being characterized by the succession of Eastern tyranny, Greek citizenship, and Christian Germanic liberty, modern historiography has utterly rejected this approach as anachronistic and also unfair when it comes to understanding non-European civilizations. Also, the idea of seeing the history of humanity somehow culminating in the enlightened Prussian state of the 19th century as ideal final synthesis seems tragically naive from the perspective of the catastrophic train wreck of enlightenment in the 20th century, particularly in Germany. This is why I myself would strongly advocate to apply the dialectical theory not to world history, but only to individual civilizations, while focusing not so much on an alleged progress in liberty and enlightenment, but rather giving dialectics a cyclical and trinitary understanding. To make a long story short and simplifying as much as possible, I would say that within such a reinterpretation of dialectics, the thesis of a civilization would focus on transcendence, oneness, God, theology, interiority, and tradition, while the antithesis would dwell on immanence, diversity, humanity, technology, expansion, and reason. The synthesis, then, could be called a rational return to tradition. It must not be seen as a mere compromise between the two antagonistic initial movements. Rather, while tradition is per se instinctive, inherited, and without alternative, a rational return to tradition would mean the growing insight into the idea that humanism, if devoid of any form of transcendent anchoring, must ultimately lead to relativism and nihilism, and that a society led astray by its faith in allegedly pure reason must ultimately find back its way to tradition in order to avoid total dissolution. A return to tradition which, because of its conscious aspect, cannot, however, be the immediate origin of a new civilizational cycle, and has rather to be seen as the final utterance in a long sequence of words, a final word that gives its sense to the whole sentence, but also constitutes its closing. We will go back to this idea later. Concerning the true object now of historiography, I would like to dwell on the importance of the notion of civilizations and defend the idea that every social body, from the smallest to the largest, represents much more than the simple sum of its constituent parts, but possesses its own historical identity and existence, which is conferred unconsciously by the common accord of all its components, and therefore allows comparison with other similar social bodies. In what follows, we will thus define as civilizations those autonomous social entities that are the most extensive collective bodies, both in time and space, but just below the level of human history itself. Of course, it would be naive to deny that these social entities are subject to multiple external influences. Nevertheless, each civilization is unified and animated by an inimitable, unique, and indissoluble spiritual impulse. And as long as this impulse animates the men who carry the civilization, it will respond only to its own laws and dynamics. The fusion now of these two quasi-a priori foundations of historical dynamics and social phenomenology makes it possible, at least in my view, to develop some form of unified theory of comparative research that allows both a pertinent description of the dynamic relationships within a given social entity and a precise methodological comparison between different civilizational units in a similar dynamic location. But before presenting how to apply this method to our historical evidence, one word on the importance, once again, of transcendence and civilizational mentalities. What is transcendence? Now, in our definition, to recognize transcendence is to recognize that the concrete world around us, of which we are a part through our material bodies and which affects us daily with its many deficiencies and disappointments, but also its pleasures and satisfactions, can only derive its being from a higher essence that guarantees its uniqueness and existence without merging with it. The absolute one, who is beyond all distinctions and contradictions, and without whom no being could exist, no feeling of deficiency be felt, no thoughts spring forth, no surge of love be experienced. The best of all worlds would be exhausted in the molten and static entropy of permanent satisfaction. Pure materiality, in its immutable and eternal petrification, would not allow any feeling of need or dissatisfaction, because no alternative would be imaginable. Paradoxically, it is precisely the deficiency of happiness and perfection, and therefore the question of theodicy, that is the proof of the existence of a superior and transcendent principle. This transcendence, which is the supreme oneness, and therefore also by definition truth, beauty, and goodness, has been felt, perceived, and venerated by humans in the most diverse ways throughout human history. And although, despite the historical existence of such a perennial philosophy, the dogmatic differences between transcendentalist schools are often considerable, and by no means to be minimized or even abundant, in favor of some kind of vague, disembodied theism or syncretism, the three consequences of recognizing transcendence are relatively similar throughout our history and all civilizations. Firstly, the conviction that this transcendent being does not merge with the created world, but is superior to it, and as a result, is removed from any limiting constraints such as time or space. Secondly, the vision of the world as a divine creation, and therefore, at least partially and very deficiently, as a mirror of the beauty, goodness, and truth of divinity. And finally, the deduction that the part of our human existence that is capable of knowing transcendence and of reaching out towards it must be of the same deep essence as the later, and therefore participate to some extent in its immortal qualities. Hence, the idea of the existence of a soul, through which the creature returns to the union with its creator. Now, anyone who rejects these three axioms is not merely making a simple choice between different variants of private spiritual convictions. He is unwittingly, or sometimes also voluntarily, depriving himself of the noblest parts of his existence, which, moreover, is the keystone of any human civilization worthy of that name. By removing this single element of civilizational identity, the whole historical construct must sooner or later disintegrate, which is the case with Europe today and has been the case with numerous other civilizations before us. As was said earlier, transcendence is absolute, but humanity is not. This means that all civilizations develop their own approach of the ultimate one and are influenced in this by their very specific cultural mentality. In a sense, one could say that the history of a civilization is nothing else than the systematic unfolding of all the potentialities lying in a specific approach of transcendence. First, through its positive endeavor to understand it in its absolute otherness, then through the increasing errors of reducing it to mere immanence, and finally through the humility of the conscious return to tradition, which closes the cycle of possibilities and leads to a slow petrifaction. Now, history provides us with very numerous examples of this. So, and now there will follow quite a lot of bizarre and exotic dynasties. Thus, to proceed now in a vaguely chronological order, the Sumerian civilization was based on a vision of transcendence, focusing on the absolute submission of the individual to a highest reality that can only be accepted and venerated, but whose own possible. In the history of that civilization, the early dynastic phase represents traditional thesis, while the third dynasty of Uruk inaugurates the antithetical phase that then culminates in the identity crisis and wars against the Gutis, led by the fifth dynasty of Uruk, with the Augustan civilizational synthesis represented by the famous third dynasty of Ur, after which Mesopotamia rapidly declined and definitely left history as an independent historical actor. In Egypt, the spiritual worldview was completely dominated by the idea of the Ma'at, that is, the just order of things, an order that is not immanent or merely conceived for the pragmatic ordering of earthly things, such as partly in Sumer, but is rather conceived and legitimized from the hereafter, the care of which is at the center of concern not only of the individual, but of the Egyptian civilization as a whole, so that one can justifiably regard the entire pharaonic state as an association for the safeguarding of that very life in the hereafter through collective considerations of the laws of the Ma'at. While the thesis of the Egyptian civilization is represented by the Old Kingdom, the antithesis begins with the emergence of the Middle Kingdom, which on many levels and despite a certain form of continuity differs radically from the achievements of its predecessors in terms of, for example, individual piety, the status of the king, the construction of society, and so forth. The transition to the synthesis is marked then by the trauma of the Amarna episode with its authoritarianism, egalitarianism, and at least from an Egyptian point of view, atheism, and by the disorders that followed from it, leading then to the restoration of the 19th dynasty, which after the traditionalist restoration of Sethos and the Ramessides saw then the gradual political, artistic, religious decline of Egypt and ushered in a long period of external domination and internal petrification. The Assyro-Babylonian civilization, though in direct continuity with the Sumerian one, was characterized by a completely different approach to the essential questions of human existence, which is often described as henotheistic. The deity was regarded less as the proprietor of a city than the protector of a clan, of a family, via its proximity with its patriarch, and therefore had an intimate personal and not only administrative function. While the old Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms represented the traditional thesis of this civilization, its antithesis was inaugurated by the Assyrian Middle Kingdom, which succeeded the feudal traditionalism of the Mitanni. The revolutions associated then with the emergence of the Iron Age and the modernism of the Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually led to the troubles of the reign of Shamsi-Adad V, and the Sargonid Empire represents then the final civilizational synthesis, rapidly exhausting forces and, after the Neo-Babylonian interlude, transforming into a post-historic society, serving as depoliticized fiscal engine for successive Iranian empires. In ancient China, spiritual history was based on a very special form of shamanism, which at least in historical times, was less concerned with direct contact with the gods than rather with the ancestors, who lent a transcendent component to the family in this world and became the center of harmony between the two worlds. The gods were of course still worshipped in the continuity of archaic polytheism according to their regional or functional characteristics, but a genuine anthropomorphic mythology or cosmogony never really emerged that would have been comparable in its popularity or unambiguousness to that of classical antiquity. While now the Shang dynasty and the Western Zhou are to be considered as the thesis of this ancient Chinese civilization, the antithesis was brought about by the advent of the Eastern Zhou and the many innovations of the spring and autumn phase, whose wars and cultural transformations culminated in the warring kingdoms and the cultural revolution of the collectivist legalism of the Qin. The synthesis was finally brought about by the Han Empire, under which China solidified into a bureaucratic, retrospective, and post-historical state, whose internal troubles eventually led to the conquest of Central Asia by nomads and many centuries of disorder before the emergence of a new Chinese civilization based rather on Tao Buddhism and with its center of gravity in the south, not the north. At least in the Western civilization, classical antiquity now is probably the best known case of a typical civilizational cycle. Now, its specific worldview is so fundamentally different from ours, being based on an extremely corporeal, Apollinian interpretation of transcendence and nature, that much of our feeling of proximity to antiquity is illusory. While the traditionalist thesis corresponds to the Greek Dark Age and the aristocratic society of the Homeric and Hesiodic texts, we can consider the entire classical and post-classical phase of antiquity from the 5th century BC onwards as an antithesis to the preceding period, culminating in the dystopian conditions of the late Roman Republic. The transition to synthesis then took place in the midst of the horrific convulsions of the civil wars and found its close in the establishment of the Augustan Principate, a retrospective and nostalgic synthesis of the history, of the entire history of antiquity, which then gradually sank into the post-history of the empire. Concerning ancient India, it is difficult for us to reconstruct a precise historical development, first, of course, of the Harappa civilization, although examination of the archaeological remains suggests that what has been called phase 3C, the final phase before the destruction and abandonment of the millennia-old cities of the Indus Valley, corresponds to civilizational events probably very similar to the model outlined here. But our documentation for Vedic and Brahmanic India is again much more extensive. Well, so to speak. So to say, because with the lack of a proper historiography, that's not always evident. Obviously, the ancient Indian spiritual world is often reduced to the idea of the wheel of transmigration and thus the just and inevitable dharmic redemption of every deed. And indeed, this concept plays a fundamental role in understanding the spiritual nature of Indians. Nevertheless, it is rather a symptom or a consequence of another deeper insight that is at the very heart of the Indian worldview, that is the idea of the all-oneness of being. The monarchic society of the Kuru Empire and the feudal period of the Mahayanapada, which can be considered the thetical phase of Indian civilization, gave then way to the Shunga Empire and the great combatant states of the Shatavahana, Kshatrapa, and Kushan, with the emergence of very different social, economic, and religious models, namely Buddhism and its individualism. Thanks then to the support of the Likavi oligarchy, the Gupta conquest was to impose a religious restoration based on Hindu conservatism before then becoming exhausted, primitivized, and fragmented, thus enabling also the Muslim conquest. Concerning the Iranian civilization, its main spiritual idea is that of Mazdian dualism, as it has emerged from the Iranian interpretation of Eastern Indo-European religious beliefs. Good and evil, truth and falsehood, order and chaos, life and destructions are fundamentally opposed categories that are engaged in an eternal struggle that also dominates the lives of the individuals, clans, sub-kingdoms, and the entire Iranian people. Admittedly, the statement that dualism is the monistic basic idea of Iranian culture, as it were, seems to harbor a certain number of logical problems. But these only arise if one ignores the fact that the Iranian man consistently placed the focus of his understanding of God on the good principle and grasped its opponent, evil, in contrast, and thus at least logically subordinate to it. Achaemenids and Seleucids represented the initial thetical phase, while it was the Parthian period that broke this original political, religious, and social unity, paving the way for the advent of the modern imperialist world of the Sasanians, whose many social and ideological conflicts then led to the disastrous crisis of the egalitarian and communist revolution of the Mazdakids. Emperor Khosroes then ushered in the civilizational synthesis marked by a restoration of imperial power, a canonization of Mazdaism, a return to a stable social hierarchy, and the codification of historical memory. Political, this restoration was to be very short-lived, as the Arab invasion was to obliterate Sasanian power. Culturally, however, the era of Khosroes was to form the basis of Iranian collective identity right up to the present day. Similarly to Spengler, I would tend to consider Messianic Judaism, early Christianity, Islam, and their numerous variant sects and heresy as they unfolded during the first millennium AD in the Eastern Mediterranean world as, from a political point of view, at least one sole civilization. Its central spiritual idea is the unconditional submission of people to an unpredictable yet paternal personal power, unmitigated by any mediation. Here, the break between the thetical and antithetical phase came under the Constantinian dynasty, when religious universalism, after many centuries of non-political, pure religiosity, crystallized in its concrete political and ecclesiastical realization, leading to a period characterized by constant fierce struggles between the most diverse heresies and sects and a notable destabilization of the initial certainties. The climax was certainly reached then during the Abbasid dynasty, when the conflict between the different Muslim confessions and political philosophies tore the cohesion of the Muslim world apart. It was only the advent of the Fatimid state that restored the initial stability and gave new meaning to the notion of messianism, while canonizing religious and historical knowledge of future generations. After the fall of the Fatimids, the Muslim world fell prey to various conquerors and entered the phase of cultural petrification, already noted by contemporaries such as Ibn Khaldun and still relevant today. Mesoamerican civilization was firmly under the spell of cyclical thought. Not only the course of the year and life, but also every single manifestation of time and space was understood as a cyclical process of growth and decay, defined by the most diverse calendrical correspondences. So it was an inescapable intertwining of all life experiences and ultimately the solution of the ideas of past and future, of birth and death, of joy and pain, which all fell into one. The thetical phase, based under the spell of Teotihuacan, the main spiritual center of the entire pre-Columbian Mesoamerican world. The antithetical phase began after the fall of that city, which shook the old political and religious certainties and ushered in the late classical phase of Maya society, where transition of ritual power from the Mexican megalopolis to the numerous combatant kingdoms would lead to profound economic, religious, and social transformations. The transition to the synthetic phase then took place during the oligarchic period of the Maya of the Putun, with the Toltec conquest leading to the establishment of a federal empire that restored the political primacy of the memory of Teotihuacan before the Maya cities were slowly deserted, leaving only a landscape of ruins discovered much later by the conquistadores. In the Andean civilization, world and transcendence were characterized by the idea of dualism, or rather complementarity, not to be mistaken with the moralizing Iranian approach. Here it was the Moche society that constituted the initial thesis repudiated by successive states such as Tiahuanaco, Huari, and Chimu. The final synthesis was then achieved with the establishment of the Inca Empire, which, although the absence of written sources and problems interpreting also the Quipu evidence make this particularly difficult to reconstruct. And this Inca period then proceeded to reinterpret history and impose its own reading of longue durée Andean tradition, a restoration largely completed already before the arrival of the conquistadores, who then simply put an end to a civilization that had already reached the end of its evolution some decades ago. The Southeast Asian civilization was placed in the continuity of the Indian civilization and thus adopted Hinduism and Buddhism, but reshaped them by recourse to the South Indian Dravidian folk religion, which essentially cultivated the idea of loving tantric union with the deity, the idea of bhakti. Hence emerged both the Shivaist variant of Hinduism and the Southeast Asian forms of Buddhism, which were no longer perceived as opposing but rather complementary. So that in Indonesia, for example, Shiva and Buddha were often even regarded as one and the same person. Here, after the initial Thetic period of Funan and Chenla, it was the emergence of the Khmer kingdom that must be considered as the beginning of the antithetical modern phase, when the ancient feudal and universalist order was gradually replaced by the economic, political, and religious rationalism of Angkor. The dynastic troubles before the advent of Yayavarman VII represent a transitional phase towards the synthesis achieved by this monarch, after whom the Khmer kingdom rapidly fell into decline. In Tao Buddhist China, the ancestral and shamanist cult of ancient China was gradually put aside in favor of a more transcendent vision of religion based on the notion of an ultimate form of nothingness, described through a form of theologia negativa, a nothingness which, however, was largely devoid of the pessimism of Buddhist India and entered into numerous syncretisms with folk religion and made Chinese Buddhism as well as Taoism seem very close to each other. In Tao Buddhist China, the Tang and Northern Song empires represented the Thetical traditionalist phase, while the Jurchen and Mongol conquest made it possible to deconstruct the old order and bring about the numerous social, political, religious transformations, paving the way for the Ming dynasty, which covered most of this antithetical phase. It is during the last decades of this dynasty that we then find the culmination of the antithesis before the takeover of the Qing brought with it a restoration of tradition and created the final civilizational synthesis, which, when Western influence began to make itself felt, was still vigorous enough to adopt and imitate European technology in order to become a potential formidable adversary of the West. And finally, let us shortly consider Japan, whose chronological development was surprisingly parallel to that of Tao Buddhist China. Here, despite the formal adoption of Chinese Buddhism as well as Taoism, local pantheist cults shaped an outlook onto transcendence that focused essentially on the aesthetics of pure form and considered morality or emotionality more like a formal and ritual problem than as elements representative of transcendence values. In Japan, after the adoption of the Chinese civilization ushered in the Thetic phase of civilization, it was the establishment of the shogunate model from the Kamakura period onwards that put an end to the old traditionalist world and inaugurated an antithetical period of intense intellectual, political, and increasingly social struggle, which reached its apogee during the period of civil wars and the Christian threat of the time of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. The synthesis was then brought about by the Tokugawa shogunate, which created the final incarnation of Japanese civilization, which, despite its petrified state, was nonetheless resilient enough to imitate European technology under the Meiji Restoration in order to guarantee, like China, its political survival in the face of the West. And now let us finally consider our own civilization, after you have seen more or less how I tried to decline this idea of a traditional thesis, a rationalist antithesis, and some form of rational return to tradition in a synthesis through these many civilizations. Now, it was towards the end of the first millennium AD, with the imperial coronation of Charlemagne and the Renovatio Imperii of the Ottonians, that the spiritual upheaval that marked the true beginning of European civilization took place. It would be wrong to regard the Translatio Imperii from Rome to the north as a simple revival of ancient Roman imperial tradition, increasingly Christianized since Constantine, or to attribute it to contemporary quarrels with the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Pope's thirst for recognition. For while all these explanations are necessary to understand the evolution, they miss the central decision, which was not purely political and could not even have been so in the self-perception of these times. The political unification of the Romans, Germanic and Slavic countries at the heart of the future Europe, the refoundation of the Roman Empire as the last eschatological bulwark against the apocalypse, the reorganization of the Western monastic system as the backbone of the economic and cultural renaissance of the West, the dogmatic emancipation of the West from the Eastern Church after the Trinitarian quarrel over the filioque, and the rebirth of classical art under the auspices of typically Western Romanesque art, all of these are inseparable, and they betray an entirely new civilizational impetus that was sought in vain in Northwestern Europe over the preceding centuries. The religious core of the Western civilization is, of course, Christianity, or, to be more exact, Roman Christianity. Yet it would be wrong to regard Christianity as totally synonymous with Europe. On the one hand, no one would consider that the Christians of East Asia or Central Africa had become Europeans only because of their new confession of faith. And on the other, we must not forget that the Christianity of the first millennium differed in many points from that of the second millennium, as the conflict between the Orthodox and the Western churches still shows today, for example, over the doctrine of transubstantiation or, of course, the exact understanding of the Trinity. Hence, if we look for what makes Europe truly European and makes its version of Christianity and thus of transcendence so typically Western, we rather have to point to its unbridled quest for the absolute, the desire to reach and surpass the horizon, the Habsburgian plus ultra, the Faustian impulse, as it has so often been rightly called, which leads from the Irish mariner epics and the gigantic Ottonian churches over the numerous nightly quests for the Holy Grail to the filigree architecture of the towers of the castles of the late Middle Ages. After the beginning of the early modern era, however, this Faustian longing has shifted from spirituality and tradition to practical science and the conquest of the material world, and is now, today, celebrating its belated and increasingly problematic triumphs. But this brings us to another fundamental question, namely how this Faustian impulse manifests itself, unfolds, and finally exhausts itself as the true essence of Western history in and through its history, making the historical situation of the present more comprehensible. So, on the basis of our more Trinitarian understanding of Western history, it can be said that the history of the Middle Ages should be seen as the probably thetic phase of this evolution, while what is generally regarded as the modern age is obviously the antithetical reaction to this phase. The Middle Ages created a world in which the understanding of the existence of God, the belief in the dogmas of the Christian Church, the fundamental agreement between philosophy and religion and theology, the conviction of the primacy of transcendence over matter, the need to place the individual within a strictly hierarchical social order, the simultaneous understanding of the equality of all before God, the complementarity of temporal and spiritual power, the valorization of the sacrum imperium as the ultimate political expression of Christianity, and the understanding of oneself as a late and tired period immediately preceding the end of history, the end of times, were generally recognized and part of a holistic worldview. The turning point from the 15th to the 16th century, even if it had been prepared unconsciously much earlier, was to shatter all the convictions of that half millennium and behaved in every respect as the antithesis to the Middle Ages. God was replaced by an individual pretending to be the measure of all things. The insight into the superiority of transcendence was supplanted by the doubts of the critique of reason. Theology on the one hand and philosophy and sciences on the other were placed in fundamental opposition to each other. The unity of the church was shattered by the Reformation. The political order dominated by the old empire was fragmented by the formation of the First Nation states. The efficiency and anonymity of bureaucracy pushed aside the pre-modern personal ideals of loyalty and duty. The traditional social hierarchies based more on honor than on wealth were turned upside down. The certainty of the immortality of the soul faded away. The Sacrum Imperium lost its prestige and became a powerless patchwork. And the expectation of the return of the Lord was transformed into a vulgar confidence in endless progress and the feasibility of purely material utopias. However, it would be a mistake to regard this antithetical counter-movement of the modern age as a simple dualistic, even Manichaean negation of the Middle Ages. For we must not forget that all the currents that marked the first half millennium of Western history also determined the second, even if their trajectory changed fundamentally. There is still a great deal, unfortunately, of salvation history in the faith in progress. The priest has quite often simply been replaced by the expert. The Faustian impulse no longer built cathedrals reaching for the sky, but gigantic skyscrapers. The saving of the soul has been replaced by the saving of the environment. The impulse to convert the infidel has become an effort to impose the Western interpretation of human rights. Original sin has been supplanted by a negative anthropology. And even in the globalist aspiration of the present, we find still much of the energy that originally constituted the inner strength of the Holy Roman Empire. Our present day, at the beginning of the 21st century, now undoubtedly represents the apogee of this antithetical movement. But as in the case of the late Middle Ages, increasingly powerful countervailing forces are now afoot, albeit still subterraneanly. And we must therefore expect the antithetical movement to come towards a turning point sooner or later and pave the way towards a new and final synthesis for our civilization too. Now, the exact shape of this future can, of course, be only assumed in a very tentative, abstract way, based on the one hand on the a priori conditions of dialectics and on the empirical data of civilizational comparatism. All the same, we can say that such an Augustan synthesis of the Western civilization will formally bear the hallmarks of a return to the spiritual origins of European history, while preserving the essential material achievements of modern times. However, as has already been said, it would be to misunderstand the spirit of the synthesis to see it as a simple compromise between the first two phases of a ternary cycle. On the contrary, the synthesis will elevate the logical conflict between tradition and reason to a new level by creating the awareness that even the social, scientific, cultural, or political achievements of modern times are ultimately not in opposition to, but rather deeply tributary to Faustian's man's original sense of transcendent unity, and that the abandonment of transcendence was an inevitable and heroic but tragic error that needs to be corrected before nihilism destroys all on its passage. A rational and voluntary return to transcendence, tradition, and unity. This would be, in a nutshell, the key to understanding the inmost core of such an imminent final synthesis, which at the same time would also represent the closing chord in the symphony of the West. Now, to sum up, we've tried to sketch a new reading of history, neither based on the individual nor on humanity, but rather on a comparison of civilizations based on the idea that history is essentially the unfolding of different unique views of transcendence. First, firmly celebrating its absolute elevation and reflecting on man's share in immortality, then sinking deeper and deeper into arrogance, materialism, and immanence. It is only the civilizational synthesis that finally reconciles tradition and reason in a short but intense conclusion, which ultimately defines the legacy of a given civilization to its potential successors. History would thus be a quest to grasp, celebrate, betray, and humbly reintegrate transcendence following the most diverse modes of understanding developed by different civilizations. But of course, this also opens up the question of our own attitude towards the future that such a vision of history would predict. History seems to teach us that every human civilization is doomed sooner or later to exhaustion and then disappearance. A disappearance which, while not necessarily linked to catastrophic events, certainly implies the slow diminution of the specific and unique energy that initially drove it. So anyone who speaks about the decline of the West is in no way denying the fact, relatively commonplace after all, that human life in Europe itself will continue even after the end of our civilization, and that the latter, at least to some extent, will continue to exist in an increasingly indirect and selective way in collective memory. This approach also allows us to better define our position in the apparent conflict between defeatism and realism. Determinist schools are often criticized for ultimately leading either to catastrophism or to defeatism. Both criticisms seem to me to be unjustified. At last, from the point of view of most religions and philosophies, everything that has to do with existence in this world is characterized by its finite nature and is therefore doomed sooner or later to disappear. At least in the context of human life, this seems immediately logical and inevitable. And yet, apart from a few exceptions, few will resign themselves to abandoning, even in old age, any hopes, projects, or ambitions, but will try to adapt them as best as they can to the biographical realities that are theirs. The same should apply also to the decline of a civilization. It is part of the millenary logic of every civilization from its beginning and contains a metaphysical meaning equal to that of its birth, to its adolescence or its apogee. Consequently, for anyone who recognizes these facts, it is not a question of entertaining the false hope of being able to guarantee the West an eternal life by saving the West, but rather of helping it to play its role until the end, and to do so in an honest, dignified, and proud manner. The comparative study of civilizations can play a major role in this context because it can make it possible to foresee, at least to a certain degree, the contours of this evolution and therefore to adapt cultural action optimally to these conditions with two objectives. The first objective would be to avoid hastening the end of the West through inappropriate behavior and to avoid imitating the fate of those aging people who, despite undeniable realities, deny their own mortality and adopt a lifestyle that is not only undignified and ridiculous, but also accelerates even their physical decline. The West has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors as an enormous patrimonial and spiritual heritage, and it is our duty to accept it with respect for the world, for the work of our fathers, so that we can leave it also to our own descendants. And the second would be to fulfill our duty not only with view to our own descendants, but also to future civilizations. Just as the West has benefited immensely from the heritage of the Greco-Roman world, we must allow future civilizations to draw inspiration from our efforts, our successes, our misfortunes, and above all, our specific and unique vision of what is true, beautiful, and good. It is certain that, just as was the case with our reception of antiquity in the Near East, this future reception of our civilization will be selective, perhaps even unintentionally opposed to its initial spirit. But the fact remains that this is the only form of immortality that we can offer our civilization in this world. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Well, that was dense.
Yeah.
And I think quite good. I'm going to forego the 3 questions-ish I have, because I think the room's probably full of them by this point. And if there's still time, I'll give myself that. We have to be out of this room by around 20 past. And evensong will take place, self-sung evensong will take place just down corridor in the chapel, in the smaller chapel, which you're more than welcome to join us for, followed by Mass. Would anyone like to come in with a question for Father George? We'll start.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just looking at a note that I made.
Daniel.
I'm trying to think about what you said earlier when you first spoke about Christianity or where Christianity fits. You spoke about this is part of a Near Eastern view of God. The idea was one of submission to the transcendent, and that included Israelite, Jewish, the Christian moment, or at least the founding, and the rise of Islam. And I'm trying to think how that idea of transcendence, in a sense, then must be one quite different from a Christian self-understanding, because it suggests an idea or a transcendent idea somehow outside of a Christian understanding of the ultimate transcendent. If I could explain. So from the Christian point of view, there's not some transcendent that embraces the Christian understanding of God, the Holy Trinity, an ancient Israelite notion of a single deity in a Muslim idea. From a Christian point of view, God, the Holy Trinity, is the ultimate transcendent, which embraces all these other things, and by which those other things are understood. So I may be entirely misunderstanding, but I'm trying to think this through in relation to what you said. So, but if I understood what you were saying in terms of how understanding the rise of Christianity as part of something else, then you have to kind of step outside of. You have to find a transcendent principle that embraces these other principles, as it were, that is independent, which may be logical from the point of view of your system, but could make no sense to a Christian. Because it presupposes another kind of transcendent which embraces the Christian one as well as the other two, and
the God behind the gods.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm trying to think through. That's it doesn't mean it's not right. I couldn't understand it in those terms, but that's what I'm trying to understand. If you have to find this, a God behind the gods as your ultimate transcendent principle.
Mm-hmm. I expected that kind of question also, because this is something I'm also fighting with for many times by now, also in my own vision of history. You have first to realize that my work is not essentially a theological work, but based essentially on political history, or partly also philosophical history. So let's say that the starting point of my analysis is this obvious, or at least for me obvious, fact that if we compare civilizations, we really stumble upon big similarities when it comes to these different phases. And I mean, I just presented here very simplistic, let's say, summary of the system, which is a bit more complicated and to which I treat my students in France. So they have many hours of that, much more into details, not this here half an hour. So the starting point is that obviously all major civilizations, they go through similar steps. That is what I see, and so I'm trying to understand that, and I'm trying to give it a certain sense outside first of any personal religious conviction. It's just a fact that needs to be explained. How is it possible simply that we see, as well in China as in Egypt and in Mesoamerica, that we have these civilizations that appear? They have all their very unique outlook on understanding transcendence, and somehow they have this first phase where they develop transcendence, and then basically, and I'm simplifying a lot here, a second phase where they reject transcendence, and then this short synthesis which creates some form of final empire that then very quickly petrifies. And that seems to me an empirical fact, at least from my point of view. And I'm trying to understand that. And of course, this leads then to also a form of relativization, of course, of our own belief, as we see it as being a part of a mechanism that seems to unfold very often. But we need to separate, I think, the notion of civilization from that of religion. Of course, there's a link between both, but we see that many religions in world history have continued through different civilizations. Take, for example, Buddhism. Buddhism emerges in a typically Indian situation, and now is more or less extinct in India, whereas it thrives in China and Japan. So religions are not bound to civilizations. It's not, and that was one of the points I was trying to make. Christianity is, of course, the soul and the main expression of our quest for transcendence. but Christianity will survive the West, which is, I hope, a good news from a certain point of view, because it shows that who knows if we continue our trajectory as we have it today. Well, Christianity, if you look at France, if you look at Germany, if you look at most European countries, apart from a small minority, it is more or less dead already, whereas Islam is massively thriving in France. I know this is very politically incorrect, but it is really obvious. And so a political future where in 50 or 100 years Christianity would be some form of underground religion in a state that is largely dominated rather by Islam than Christianity is not an impossibility anymore. 50 years ago, it would have seemed absurd. Today, if you go to Paris, you must be blind not to see this evolution, or in Marseille or in Lyon. So it is possible that Christianity could perhaps disappear in large parts from the West, but continue its path in Africa, in Latin America, perhaps even in Asia also. So I think we need to make a distinction from the fact that religions can be also taken over by civilizations, reinterpreted following to their own quest, their own specific view of the world, of God, but also continue to survive. So that's why I'm not trying to say or to relativize Christianity as being just an expression of the Western civilization. Christianity is much more important than Western civilization, and Western civilization may disappear, whereas Christianity may continue, but perhaps in other forms. And that is what I also wanted to say when I compared the fundamental nature of Christianity in the first millennium and the second millennium. And once again, I know this is a tricky subject, so if I speak now about Buddhism, that may be clearer. Probably we are speaking about 1,000 or 2,500 years of Buddhism, but if you really look at Indian Buddhism as it was meant originally and to its concrete reality today, in China, for example, in Japan, you see a huge difference. It's the same texts that are used, it's some same basic ideas, but it's undeniable that there's an evolution. There's a very different interpretation also of certain of the key concepts. And I think in Christianity, there is something also a little bit similar to that happening. If we look, and I fix that essentially, but of course also because it fits my system so well, with the emancipation of Western Christianity under Charlemagne from the Eastern Church. And I think that the filioque is a fundamental difference. It's not just a marginal point of theology. The fact that we, as Western Christians, see Trinity as something deeply interrelated, where the Holy Spirit also emerged from the Son and not only from the Father, I think that is a fundamentally different view of God than in the Eastern Church, where we have rather a more paternally centered vision of Trinity, with God from whom emerges the Son and the Holy Spirit. But there is this form of more patriarchal model that is behind, that we find also from a certain point of view in preceding Judaism and even in Islam, whereas the Western form of Trinity seems to be quite different. And so that is why I'm not advocating or saying that this now Western Christianity is a different religion from that of the first millennium, but I see a fundamental difference, and that fits quite well, of course, with this model of different civilizations developing, taken over, reinterpreting also religions following to their own, let's say, subliminal view on God, nature, human beings. So.
I'd love to follow up with refine that, but I don't know if I should now. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I was a little bit puzzled when you were trying to compare or define the various civilizations, and you mentioned the term relative or relativism. What came to my mind were the words by Bertrand Russell: if something is relative, you have to ask what is it relative to. So you do need an absolute. Because how do you otherwise, if not judge, but assess or evaluate the various civilizations? You need an absolute standpoint. Otherwise, if you use just relativism, everything disintegrates. So you need this absolute standpoint. And what also came to my mind, you probably know, no doubt, the book by Berdyaev, The Meaning of History, that history has a goal. And this is something that Christianity has inherited from Old Testament Judaism, from Old Testament Israel, that history has a purpose, that there is a meaning to history. As I just said, Berdyaev's book is entitled The Meaning of History. And Christ says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. So there you have, there's a beginning to history, and there is an end, there's a purpose, there's a final goal. So somehow not quite found that in your talk, that being brought out sufficiently, perhaps, from my point of view.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. Two questions. Well, when it comes to the absolute standpoint, that is precisely why I'm so interested in linking this theory of history to more metaphysical and ontological ideas, and why, for me, the fact to tie back the evolution of civilizations to the understanding of transcendence, to the unfolding of transcendence in this world, and to the return of transcendence also through the world once again to God, seems to be quite a nice view to understand that. You could even understand the history of every civilization basically through the steps of the Holy Trinity, a little bit like Joachim of Florus has also tried in the like Joachim.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it in English, but Joachim von Flor, Joachim de Flor, Joachim of Florus.
Also tried to show, like many others, also Hegel from a certain point of view also tried to tie back his dialectical model also to a more metaphysical understanding of dialectics, of the Trinity. And so that is why I would precisely not just limit myself to description, because such a pure description doesn't have any standpoint, but to try to understand it through the necessity that transcendence in this world unfolds itself ever and ever, to say. And even outside and before Christianity, we see how other religions and how other civilizations have gone through very similar phases, which is also from a Christian point of view not that amazing, as we know, of course, that there is the idea of the logos spermatikos. There's the idea of St. Augustine that says that basically, well, even before Christianity, still there is Christianity as a religion, that there is a fundamentally natural religion, as he explains it also in his Consolations, that was already there before the advent of Christ, as the truth is not something that is revelated at one moment and one point of history, but that is there all the time. Basically, truth must be in everything. It is not just something we do not really realize, where we need basically the coming of Christ for. I mean, already the church fathers also knew very well that all philosophers who lived following the precepts of Christianity, even without knowing them, should be considered as Christians. So there is this idea also in Christianity of an overarching fundamental belief in transcendence and in the laws that follow from transcendence. And so I'm just trying then in this much larger project, of course, to link, let's say, essentially the political, but also partly artistic, economic, philosophical evolution of civilizations to such a trinitary concept of being. And concerning Berdyaev, of course, that's an eminently theological question that is linked to the question of the end of the world. And of course, the world must end. It's sure that there is only one eternity, and that is with God. Our world is not eternal. Obviously, if not, there would be two eternities, or we would have to assume a pantheistic point of view. So sure, of course, the world must come at one point or the other to an end. But for the moment, we are in this unfolding of history, which is also a history of salvation. And I think that it is interesting also to see that this history of salvation, this history of unfolding of transcendence is not only relevant and can not only be shown in Western civilization, but we can see it in all other civilization, which from a certain point of view even underpins the importance of our belief. So I wouldn't see basically such an understanding as somehow in conflict with the basic convictions of Christianity, but rather to the contrary, to see that even before Christianity and outside of the West, still history can be understood following metaphysical and ontological concepts that are deeply Christian.
So let's do a
With your title of your talk, Is Universal History Possible? With there being a beginning and an end to history and Christ at the center, obviously it is possible. Universal history is possible.
From that point of view, yes. History now as a history of progress, for example, doesn't make any sense. That is obvious, and that is precisely what we are doing mostly today. History is some form of history of progress that is never ending, and so this kind of Condorcet model is not tenable. And of course, that is more or less what I would say 99% of my colleagues would probably believe in. So
let's do a speed round. Let's do a speed round now. So do you want to take note of the questions?
Sure.
How many people still have questions? One there. We'll start. We'll go from here to here, and then any. Okay, and then okay. One, two, three, four. And then we'll have him do a collected response.
Yes. Is there a wider version of this that could be possible to argue for? Yeah, I was thinking of Carl Jasper's acceleration theory, for example. Yeah, so any comment on that would be obviously.
Yes, my question has to do with method. I usually hate questions on method, but I can't resist this one. So how do you know a civilization when you see it? How do you know that a particular grappling with transcendence, let's call it, qualifies? Were there close calls? Were there, this doesn't quite make the cut, or was it really self-evident? I'm just curious about that.
That was my question as well.
Okay.
You may have already answered it, but my question would be, since you make the kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis model, and you say you have the traditional and then the rationalist revolt, so to speak, and then some kind of synthesis that relativizes transcendence.
It returns to transcendence.
Yeah, exactly. The question would be, in Christian revelation, the transcendence and immanence are already united in Christ. So would you say that there is a distinctive quality that's different to the Christian civilization than even theoretically to any other civilization that has ever existed because of that unification? You may have already answered this, but
Thank you very much for this question. So concerning the axial period, I wrote a lengthy paper on that question. I think it's not tenable anymore. Jasper's idea. It is tenable to the fact that if you put these civilizations, as I'm doing also in my lectures, on a screen in order to show which overlaps, then indeed you can see that around 500 there is a series of civilizations developing in very different parts of the world that roughly are at the same time, so that obviously roughly the same is happening in them, in China and classical antiquity, basically. A little bit in Iran is not the same case. So that is what led Jaspers to this idea that world history somehow goes to a next step, but it is just because there were 2 or 3 civilizations roughly evolving at the same time, so that obviously similar things happened also in roughly the same time. And in Jaspers is of course very roughly, because Socrates, Lao Tse, Confucius, Zoroaster, they do not really Buddha, certainly not Buddha, they do not really live at the same time. So it's very roughly from his point of view. So I think he errs in that. He's mistaken because he doesn't see these civilizational anchoring. Can send you a paper on that where I try to show that. Now, how do we know a civilization when we see it? Well, that's of course that's a very good question. I mean, when does something start to be a forest? Is it because there are 10 trees, 15, 20, 18 and a half? So, I mean, we can always, there's always this problem. When does something transform from mere quantity in quality? And of course, it's a question of zooming in and zooming out. If you zoom in very strongly, you only see human beings. If you zoom out a little bit, there are villages. If you zoom out very strongly, there's just humanity, or perhaps even not so. So it's a question of zooming and of assuming that at a certain moment, certain things appear. And my definition is, on the one hand, yeah, civilization is a body, is a large body just below the level, so the largest possible body below the level of humanity, largest possible society below that, where, of course, something like that happens. And I mean, it's of course interesting to see that, to ask that question, but it is, on the other hand, so intuitively clear already, if you go into a museum, or if you travel the world, that there is such a thing as a Greco-Roman civilization, very different from the Iranian, which is also very different from the Indian, or from the Chinese, or of course from the Mesoamerican, and that there are some outliers that somehow belong to them. Of course, there are also fuzzy spheres in between them. There is some overlapping, and I mean, I'm a German-speaking Belgian whose second mother language is French, and who lives now in Poland. So there are a lot of intersections, of course, in me, and that gives also, of course, some identity problems, because, well, you feel not really as a German, but not really as a French, but Belgium doesn't really exist as a nation either. So there's a lot of conflict. So I can understand that there are also intersections, but that doesn't mean that the basic idea doesn't exist, because even though I would say I don't really feel like a French because I have this German influence, I would never say there isn't such a thing as French mentality, because I feel it very strongly. It's just that I don't really belong to it entirely, but it's there very obviously. And I think that is a bit the error that many modern archaeologists or historians do, to focus just on these intersections and trying to deconstruct the idea of civilization, whereas I think until very recently nobody would ever have had this idea, and that even the people who lived within these civilizations were very clearly aware that they belonged to a certain form of humanity and knew that they didn't belong to another one. Even someone living probably in Syria on the border to the Iranian Empire under the Roman Empire would have felt nearer to someone living in Spain than to someone living 200 or 300 kilometers in Iran, for example. So even today also, I think that very probably someone living in the south of Spain is probably nearer still to someone living in Italy or even in England than probably to someone living in Morocco. Of course, there are similarities in food and climate, but still, from a civilizational appartenance, I think it is something we can grasp very well. But define it, that's indeed a big question. And then the question, yeah, on immanence and transcendence. Well, I mean, it's this idea that I'm now playing the role of a historian, not of a believer. I have to, because the system is there and the obvious facts are there. So if I want to be consistent with this approach, I would say that probably most Buddhists would say the same thing. And most Taoists also. They also see in Lao Tse or in Buddha also the immanent incarnation of a transcendent principle that is absolutely beyond and still was incarnated at a certain period of time. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not one of these, don't want now to say Buddha, Lao Tse, Christ, all Muhammad, all the same, all some prophets appearing here and there. That's not what I'm saying. But if you look at their theology, they believe, at least from their point of view, in something very similar. Believing also that Buddha is not just one human being. Buddha, from this point of view, has always existed. He was always somehow existent and had this incorporation, but there is this Buddha nature, so that all Buddhas, to a certain point of view, are all incarnations of the same idea that is even existing outside of time and space. So, of course, there are also huge theological and dogmatic differences, and it's not at all the same like in Christianity, but the basic idea can be compared with great interest. And that is also something that is so interesting for me, and I may say that perhaps as some form of closing remark, that in this study of civilization I'm doing for many years, and I'm still newcomer to many many of these civilizations. But you, in the end, you do not, at least for me, my result in studying them is not, well, they're all the same and one world and global civilization and basically it's all just about social questions. No, it is precisely in the differences that matter, and there are a lot of differences, and these differences, but also similarities, and they make it possible for us not to adapt theirs, but to better to understand also what makes us particular. And there are many things that I suppose to be self-evident, where I thought, well, Christianity has that, but all others must be like that also. And in the end, no. There are certain small details in our own civilization, our own faith, where you suddenly see, wow, that is something that makes us very typical, that is really particular, that needs to be focused on. And there are other things where we might think erroneously, this is typically for us, and then we see, no, it is not. So it shifts perspectives, and I think we need to be open to that, not open to convert to other religions or to fuse everything, that's not it. But we need to go into the details and be open for the fact of seeing that there are things that might seem typically Christian and that are not, whereas there are things that seem like minor dogmatic quibbles without any interest that suddenly emerge as being the true originality that we might have. So it is, from a pedagogical point of view, at least, but concerning my own evolution, highly stimulating, to say the least.
Thank you so much for that. We'll have to watch it a few times on a slow setting on YouTube to
There
really,
might be a good
really
book
take
coming
it.
out
Oh, there
someday.
might be a book coming out of this. So excellent, and we'll look for that in English as well.
I think it will first be in French.
Have you thought about this identity crisis? Maybe you could just settle and become influence. You could become a Dutchman. You could become a you know, this is German, French,
Okay.
other. Just move a little bit north and become a Dutchman, because you also speak Dutch. Yeah, so you can get
Not very well, unfortunately.
Well,
I
God,
never
they can
really-
teach you. You're
probably.
you're very good with languages. Actually, you were part of a project in Leuven, ancient manuscript project with Greek language, weren't you?
No.
it-
Yeah. I was in the
Manuscriptum.
Greek historians.
Yeah.
The fragmentary Greek historians.
Yeah, where Brian Lapson met him. These
Yeah.
interesting connections. So
Yeah.
thank you so
Exactly.
much
Fragmentary Greek
for
historians.
treating us with this, and we'll give you a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
We have Evensong in about